Good evening and welcome to Vatican Connections. I'm your host, Noel Okel. Will the Pope step in and mediate the political crisis that's tearing the country of Venezuela apart? On one hand, you have a country that has a president who refuses to give up elected office. And the other, his rival, declared himself president-elect with the support of the people. Now, with both sides of the conflict asking the Pope to intervene, will the Holy Father actually step in? That's our feature story for tonight. But before we get to that, let's look at some of the stories on tonight's show. You go completely vegan for Lent for $1 million? I know that I certainly would, but the more interesting question is, would the Pope? For charity, of course. Was the Pope's visit to the United Arab Emirates last week worth it? The Holy Father reflects back on that trip and shares his thoughts at his weekly general audience. The newest candidate for a possible sainthood is a Jesuit. The official opening for his cause happened last week in Rome, and we'll tell you who it is and why. And this week in the history of the Vatican, do you remember where you were on February the 11th, 2013, when a surprise announcement that stunned the world was made at the Vatican? Can't quite remember? Well, here's a hint. It was an announcement that hadn't been made in almost 600 years. I'll have all that and more coming up on Vatican Connections next, so be sure to stay tuned. Okay, let's begin with a quick look at some of the headlines from the Vatican since our last episode. Just in time for the 5th World Day of Prayer Against Human Trafficking last Friday, the Pope released his new prayer intention video for the month, and he's inviting the world to join him in prayer that we may all open our hearts to the victims of human trafficking, enforced prostitution, and violence. Have a look.
Aunque tratemos de ignorarlo, la esclavitud no es algo de otros tiempos. Ante esta trágica realidad, no podemos lavarnos las manos, si no queremos ser de alguna manera cómplices de estos crímenes contra la humanidad. No podemos ignorar que hoy hay esclavitud en el mundo, tanto o más quizás que antes. Recemos por la acogida generosa de las víctimas de la trata de personas y de la prostitución forzada y de la violencia.
Let's move on now to our next story. Was the Pope's mission to the United Arab Emirates an ecumenical success? Well, many people, including the Pope, believe so. And just one day after arriving back in Rome last week, the Holy Father spoke about it during his weekly general audience. And instead of continuing his catechesis on prayer, the Pope explained that his trip wrote a new page in the history of dialogue between Christianity and Islam. Here's a quick look at what he had to say.
Prima volta un Papa si è recato nella penisola arabica e la provvidenza ha voluto che sia stato un Papa di nome Francesco, 800 anni dopo la visita di San Francesco di Assisi al sultano al-Malik al-Kamil. In un'epoca come la nostra, in cui è forte la tentazione di vedere in atto uno scontro tra le civiltà cristiana e quella islamica, e anche di considerare le religioni come fonte di conflitto, abbiamo voluto dare un ulteriore segno chiaro e deciso che invece è possibile incontrarsi, è possibile rispettarsi e dialogare, e che pur nella diversità delle culture e delle tradizioni, il mondo cristiano e quello islamico apprezzano e tutelano valori comuni: la vita, la famiglia, il senso religioso, l'onore per gli anziani, l'educazione dei giovani e altri ancora.
Now, the Pope, in fact, believes so much in the importance of interreligious dialogue that he sent a special video message on Sunday to the participants of the World Government Summit that took place in Dubai earlier this week. In his video message, the Pope not only recalled his recent visit to the UAE, he emphasized to government officials, policymakers, and industry leaders that we cannot speak of sustainable development without solidarity.
Amici, Al-Salam alaikum. La pace sia con voi. Desidero salutarvi e augurarvi buon lavoro. Porto nel cuore la visita che ho appena compiuto negli Emirati Arabi Uniti e la calorosa accoglienza che ho ricevuto. Ho incontrato un paese moderno che guarda al futuro senza dimenticare le radici. Un paese dove si cerca di trasformare in fatti e iniziative concrete le parole tolleranza, fratellanza, rispetto reciproco, libertà. Ho visto che anche nel deserto i fiori germogliano e crescono e sono tornato a casa con la speranza che tanti deserti nel mondo possano fiorire. Lo credo possibile, ma solo se cresciamo insieme, l'uno a fianco all'altro, con apertura e rispetto, disponibili a farci carico dei problemi di tutti, che nel villaggio globale sono i problemi di ciascuno. Penso a voi e al vostro impegno di questi giorni, nel quale affrontate temi fondamentali, tra cui le sfide della politica, lo sviluppo dell'economia, la tutela dell'ambiente, l'impiego delle tecnologie. Vi auguro che la domanda alla base della riflessione non sia tanto quali sono le migliori opportunità da sfruttare, ma quale tipo di mondo vogliamo costruire insieme? È un interrogativo che ci porta a lavorare pensando ai popoli e alle persone più che ai capitali e agli interessi economici. È una domanda che non guarda all'immediato di domani o di oggi, ma all'avvenire. Guarda alla responsabilità che grava su di noi, trasmettere questo nostro mondo a chi verrà dopo di noi, preservandolo dal degrado sia ambientale o altri tipi di degrado e prima ancora dal degrado morale. In realtà non si può parlare di sviluppo sostenibile senza solidarietà. Potremmo persino dire che il bene, se non è comune, non è veramente bene. Forse mai come ora il pensare e l'agire richiedono dialogo vero con l'altro, perché senza l'altro non c'è futuro per me, per ognuno di noi. Vi auguro allora nelle vostre attività di cominciare dai volti delle persone, di avvertire il grido dei popoli, il grido dei poveri, di riflettere sulle domande dei bambini. E con questi pensieri vi ringrazio e vi auguro un lavoro proficuo al servizio del bene comune e chiedo al Signore di benedire il vostro impegno per un mondo più giusto e più prospero per tutti. Grazie.
Also from Rome last week, the sainthood cause for the 28th Superior General of the Society of Jesus, Father Pedro Arrupe, was formally opened at the ceremony at the Basilica of St. John the Lateran on the 28th anniversary of his death. Arrupe was the 28th Superior General of the Jesuits from 1965 to 1983. Born in Spain in 1907, Father Arrupe entered the society in 1927. Now, following the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain in 1932, he continued his studies in Belgium, the Netherlands, and in the U.S. And after his ordination, he was sent to Japan in 1938, where he was serving in a mission just outside of Hiroshima when the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb there in 1945. But having studied medicine before entering the society, he was able to give aid to over 150 victims. At a ceremony in Rome, the current Superior General, Father Arturo Sosa, spoke about Father Arupe, the man that he was, and what makes him a great candidate for sainthood.
La cerimonia è stata una cerimonia molto formale, ma quello che voglio ribadire qua è lo spirito che era in questa sala oggi, cioè tutti quelli che siamo qua riuniti siamo veramente ammiratori di Padre Arrupe come modello di vita in sequela del Vangelo. Padre Arrupe era un uomo di preghiera, un uomo che era in contatto permanente, di grande familiarità con il Signore. Il suo cuore era lì nel Signore e dopo una persona con la sensibilità che anche il Signore Gesù aveva per i più bisognosi, non poteva non vedere i segni dei tempi in queste persone che soffrono, i migranti, i poveri, quelli senza tetto, quelli che soffrono la povertà, e per quello lui è stato una persona che ha capito che la compagnia deve servire la fede nella promozione della giustizia, nel dialogo interreligioso, nel dialogo con le culture, di mettersi a fondo nei problemi di questo tempo per fare la luce che il Signore ci porta con la sua parola, il Vangelo, e con la sua liberazione per tutti noi.
Okay, now here's an interesting story that's raising a lot of eyebrows. Will the Pope go vegan for Lent? That's the million-dollar question, and I mean literally. A vegan organization spearheaded by 12-year-old vegan activist Genesis Butler is asking the Pope to eat a plant-based diet for Lent. And if he does, the group, which is supported by many A-list celebrities, including Paul McCartney, will donate $1 million to the charity of the Pope's choice.
Pope Francis to go vegan for Lent. The $1 Million Vegan Campaign launched on February 6 in 15 countries around the world, supported by an incredible coalition of activists, researchers, and celebrities. We're asking for Pope Francis' help to protect our planet by drawing attention to the devastating impact of animal agriculture. If he agrees to go plant-based, we'll give $1 million to the charity of his choice. Farming animals for food has a greater impact on global warming than the fuel emissions from every car, bus, train, ship, and plane on the planet combined. Animal agriculture is also a leading driver of deforestation and biodiversity loss and causes immense suffering to billions of animals. In his 2015 encyclical letter, Laudato Si', Pope Francis spoke about caring for our planet and animals. By going plant-based for Lent, he would be leading the way to a more sustainable planet. Join us and fight climate change with diet change.
The campaign was announced last Wednesday, included a letter written by the 12-year-old girl to the Pope that was published in 50 newspapers around the world. Now, everyone is wondering, will the Holy Father participate for charity? At this point, the Vatican hasn't commented on the invitation, but you never know. The one thing we do know for certain is that this Pope is always full of surprises. Let's move on to our feature story. Will the Pope mediate the political crisis that has now reached boiling point in Venezuela? Here are some of the facts. Years, the social, economic, and political situation in that country has been on a downward spiral with triple-digit inflation, food and medicine shortages, violent protests, and a death toll that has reached into the hundreds, with many more arrested. Many argue that the country's decline is a result of President Nicolas Maduro's economic policies, abuse of power, and government corruption. The crisis in Venezuela has now reached a political stalemate when, on January the 23rd, the leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, declared himself interim president of the country with the overwhelming support of the people, including many European and Latin American countries, after Maduro himself refused to relinquish power on the expiration of his term that ended this past January the 10th. Now, in a diplomatic letter delivered to the Vatican early February, Maduro asked the Pope to personally step in and help mediate a peaceful resolution for the country. And last week, the Holy Father did acknowledge receiving the request, but ruled out any involvement unless the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, requested as well. Interestingly enough, during a television interview with local media last Thursday, Guaidó made a very public television appeal for the Pope to come to the country and help end the usurpation and the political stalemate in that country. And although that in itself isn't considered a diplomatic request, let's assume at some point that all the diplomatic T's are crossed and the Pope does receive an official request for mediation for Guaidó. Would he personally come to Venezuela and mediate the conflicts? And that's a very good question, brought to us by one of our viewers, Frank Hollingworth in BC, that leads us to the next part of our show, your question of the week, so don't go away. Father Tom, I have a letter that we received from a political science student, and he writes to us, "Dear Noel, I'm a second-year political science student at UBC, and lately there's been a lot of class discussion about what's happening in Venezuela and whether or not the Pope himself will intervene at the President's request." He says here, "We'd love to hear Father Rosica's thoughts on this issue on your weekly question segment of Vatican Connections, specifically how a people mediation would work, how effective it might be in binding resolutions, and does the Pope have any track record in dealing with these kinds of issues?" And he writes here, "After all, the Pope is a pastor, not a diplomat. Thanks, Frank Hollingworth from Vancouver." Another difficult one.
I'm impressed, first of all, that Frank Hollingworth would turn to you and turn to us. So I'm happy that people in Vancouver are watching Vatican Connections. But I think it's an excellent question because the topic of Venezuela has been an extremely important one for this Pope.
Yeah.
He's spoken about it since 2015. I mean, it's probably at its lowest ebb right now. Now, the Pope has been invited to be a mediator in this. But mediation isn't as easy as it looks. The Pope spoke on the plane coming back home from Panama and said very carefully, we will study this very carefully through Vatican diplomacy. Vatican diplomacy is probably one of the highest and most effective diplomacies in the world. But diplomacy can only take action or intervene when both sides agree to want a mediator. And that is what is not very clear at present. Do both sides wish to enter into mediation in this or not? And so Vatican diplomacy under the Secretary of State, especially Cardinal Pietro Parolin, is examining that whole question now, and the Pope is pleading for a cessation of violence and that the leaders take care of the people, because there's been deaths, violence, famine, unemployment, great sadness. You know, there's stores without food. We see the pictures on television. This is a shocking thing. Now, the fact of Cardinal Parolin being the Secretary of State is also quite significant because he was the apostolic nuncio in Venezuela.
Venezuela, that's
so
right.
This is not a senior diplomat talking about a place that he doesn't know. He knows it intimately, and therefore they're giving it very serious consideration. The Holy See Press Office declared just the other day when they were asked, what's the status of this mediation? Is the Pope going to intervene? The statement was, the closeness of the Holy Father and the Holy See to the Venezuelan people was reaffirmed, especially for those who suffer. The second part of the question that Frank has asked is quite interesting. The Pope is a pastor. What business does he have with diplomacy or with mediation? Every bit of the business, because part of the role of the Pope is he's above, if you will, simple political activity. As a pastor, he's deeply concerned with the lives of people. And there's a long track record for Vatican diplomacy, for Vatican mediation that's gone on. It's not always a win-win situation. It's not a given, the fact that the Vatican, through its diplomats, I think particularly of Archbishop Claudio Maria Celi, who's been involved in several diplomatic efforts, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't.
Yes.
But the fact that people are appealing to the Holy See to intervene and to bring parties together to the table is extremely significant. It is one of the most prestigious, well-respected diplomacies or diplomatic efforts
yes.
in the world.
Yes. Now, do you think, now just 2 days ago, Guaidó on a television invited the Pope to come. And I know that's not diplomatic channels, but do you think if all the T's were crossed and all the papers were filled out that the Pope would actually come himself to the country?
The Pope does not simply get on a plane. First of all, he doesn't have a plane. He doesn't hop on a plane and say, let me go over and settle this. In order for the Pope to visit, the bishops of the country have to be united for the Pope to come. Yeah. Secondly, a lot of groundwork has to take place. Yes. Parties would have to be together on this. The Pope doesn't walk into a warring situation. I think particularly of the Pope taking the risk of going to the Central African Republic a few years ago, and he made sure that there had been a ceasefire in order for him to walk into that. And then the result of his visit has resulted in some kind of a peaceful accord, yes. Even though there's still some explosions here and there. The fact of the Pope going means that a lot of groundwork takes place. The Pope is not simply a last-minute diplomat hopping on a plane and entering a situation. All the legwork has to be done beforehand, and that's really the effort of the Vatican diplomacy through its ground agents, the nuncios in each country, and the Apostolic Nuncio in Venezuela is playing a very important role in all of this.
Okay. So thank you so much. That answers the question. And finally tonight, we go back in time and look at two major historical events that happened this week at the Vatican on February the 11th. The date February the 11th is a very significant one in the history of the Vatican for two major reasons. First, it was a date that the Vatican and the government of Italy officially ended a 60-year vendetta. And second, it was a day that Pope Benedict made a surprising announcement that shocked the entire world. But we'll get to that one in just a moment. Monday was the 90th anniversary of the historic signing of the Lateran Pacts between the Holy See and Italy that officially put an end to decades of political treason caused by Italy's seizure of the Papal States in 1870. Signed in 1929, the Lateran Pact settled what was known as the Roman Question, a dispute that lasted nearly 60 years after Italy literally seized most of the Papal States. The pact, signed by then Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini and Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, the Vatican Secretary of State, established the independent state of the Vatican City and guaranteed its sovereignty, creating the smallest self-governed city-state in the world. Now, the Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula under direct rule and ownership of the Pope from about the 8th century until 1870, and were considered to be the manifestation of the Pope's temporal power. So you can imagine the political tension between the Vatican and Italy when in 1870 the Pope lost the city of Rome and had no physical territory at all except the Basilica of St. Peter and the papal residence. Well, all of that was resolved on February 11th, 90 years ago, and it's a great example that reconciliation and cooperation between former foes is in fact an achievable goal. Now, let's go back to another February 11th, but one just 6 years ago in 2013. I'm sure you remember where you were when you first heard the news that Pope Benedict announced his retirement from the papacy. Yes, it was 6 years ago on Monday when, during a gathering of cardinals, Pope Benedict announced his surprise decision to step down as a leader of the Catholic Church on the 28th of February, essentially making him the first pope to step down since Gregory XII in 1415, and the first to do so on his own initiative since Celestine V in 1294. Now, there's a lot of speculations as to the reason why. Many conspiracy theorists have suggested that the weight of the Vati leaks and the sexual abuse scandals forced the Pope into that decision. But in the end, it was just his failing health against the rigors of the job that made Benedict make the tough call, as his close friend and collaborator, the former director of the Holy See Press Office, Father Federico Lombardi, told me in this exclusive interview.
It was clear for me that he was reflecting about this already a long time before, because he had answered to the question of Peter Sewald in Light of the World, saying that if the Pope would be in the situation not to be able to do very well his ministry service for the Church, he had to resign, or it was possible that he would resign. In this sense, it was clear for me that he had this possibility in mind. And with the different trips that he had to do, the last was in Lebanon. It was very engaging and tiring for him. He has done all very well, but it was rather clear that he was using all his strength until the last resource. And then it was understandable for me that if he had in mind to resign, this time was coming more near to us.
And that's our show for the week. If you have any questions that you'd like answered on the show, drop us a line at the Salt and Light Facebook page or my Twitter handle listed below. I'm Noel Okel. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next week on Vatican Connections.